Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Conway Hall. This is the latest in our Ethical Matters series. And this evening, we're going to be talking about the truth about the Satanic Panic. This is coming from Professor Chris French, who is Emeritus Professor at Goldsmiths. He is the founder and head of the Anomalistic Psychology Unit there. He is a former editor of The Skeptic. I took over after he stepped down, and he's published over 150 articles and chapters covering a wide range of topics. This evening, he's going to be talking to us about the Satanic Panic and how the same kinds of patterns of stories that we see are still affecting us today. Chris, are you there?
I'm here.
Fantastic. I'll disappear into the background then to let you do your thing. Chris will speak for a while and then we'll take Q&A. So during the progress of this, just write your questions down and we'll get to them as soon as Chris has finished the main talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you for tuning in tonight. As I say, I'm going to be talking about the truth about satanic abuse claims. Just to say a few quick words about who I am. As Deborah said, I retired last October after 35 long, arduous years at Goldsmiths. I had a great time. I should also tell you that I am on the scientific advisory board of the British False Memory Society. So this is a topic that I do have a great deal of interest in. So I'm going to be talking, as I say, about the Satanic Panic. I just need to get rid of my screen out a little bit. That's better. So first of all, I'm really going to be talking about the kind of rise of fears about satanic abuse that arose back in the 1980s and kind of what that led to. And I'm probably going to leave for the Q&A some talk about the kind of prospects of a similar situation arriving again and why we need to be cautious. Okay. First of all, then, common beliefs about satanic abuse that were around in the 1980s and are still around in some people's minds today. Firstly, that satanic ritual abuse is widespread. It's said by the people who believe in this stuff to involve large international networks of very, very powerful people. These people are said to engage on a regular basis in satanic rituals of the most extreme kind. They involve group orgies, rape, forced abortions, paedophilic acts, animal and human sacrifices, including kind of tens of thousands of babies, cannibalism, the eating of flesh and feces, and the drinking of blood. So whatever floats your boat, I suppose. And needless to say, this all has to be covered up. So the idea is there's a massive conspiracy that this is going on a kind of a very, very widespread nature. And it's all being covered up by these very, very powerful people who are the ones who are actually indulging in this despicable behavior. Now, one of the questions that kind of arises here is why are not the kind of hundreds and hundreds of people turning up at police stations reporting this abuse. And according to those that believe in this stuff, they would argue that the victims of this ritualized satanic abuse typically actually repress their memories of what's happened to them. This is based on the psychoanalytic notion of repression. This is kind of central to this whole kind of topic. The idea is that if someone experiences some kind of trauma, then an automatic defense mechanism kicks in, and this is particularly likely to happen in the cases of sexual abuse. But this automatic defense mechanism kicks in and pushes the traumatic memory down into the unconscious mind where it can no longer be accessed. The so the repressed memories, even though they have been kind of pushed down into the non-conscious mind, the idea is they can still cause psychological damage. So, I mean, the analogy that always comes to my mind is kind of like a radioactive material that's been buried but is slowly leaking out and causing all kinds of problems. In terms of the kind of, forgive me, but ordinary childhood sexual abuse, which sadly we know is all too common. It does occur. It can cause serious psychological damage. That would kind of be expected to maybe cause things like depression, anxiety, eating disorders, low self-esteem, a whole host of other possible effects in adulthood. But the particular claim that is often made with respect to ritualized satanic abuse is that it causes something kind of much more dramatic and, I would say, controversial. That is dissociative identity disorder, or what we used to call multiple personality disorder. The idea is that the stress is so extreme that basically the person's mind is fragmented. And so you can get a situation, they would argue, where you might have, let's give you a kind of simple hypothetical example. You might have 3 different selves, or alters, as they would be referred to. And each of these alters is like a kind of a separate area of consciousness. So you might have a situation where the main central self, the one that would answer a question in everyday life if you were to pose it to them, may have no memory whatsoever of being the victim of this abuse because of repression. A second self might be aware of the first self, but not a third self. And the third self is not aware of the other 2, but does remember being abused and so on. You get all kinds of complicated kind of patterns. Now, as I say, for the people who believe in this stuff, it's often not just 3, 4 selves that they would claim, but dozens or even literally hundreds. And this is caused by the psychological defense of dissociation, hence dissociativity identity disorder. The idea is that while the trauma is actually taking place, the person is kind of putting kind of psychological distance between what's happening and their own selves, and this can cause this kind of fragmentation. The therapists who believe in this kind of idea would claim that the memories would have to be recovered and worked through if the person is going to recover, if they're going to regain psychological health. So although it may be very, very painful and emotionally distressing to have to do that, to dig up these buried memories, they have to do that if any kind of healing is to occur. So let's give you a definition of satanic ritualized abuse. This is a kind of like an official definition from Professor Jean Lafontaine, who back in the mid-90s carried out a review relating to claims of ritualized satanic abuse for the British government. She defined it as rites that allegedly include the torture and sexual abuse of children and adults, forced abortion and human sacrifice. Cannibalism and bestiality may be labeled satanic or Satanist. Their defining characteristic is that the sexual and physical abuse of children is part of rites to a magical or religious objective. Now, one of the questions that kind of obviously will no doubt occur to you is whether the people who are putting forward this claim actually believe in the reality of Satan. And the answer to this would be, it would depend who you asked. You had a really kind of weird situation back in the 80s where there were some kind of very strange bedfellows on this topic. On the one hand, and probably very understandably, Christian fundamentalists, obviously particularly in America, latched onto this idea of widespread satanic abuse. And they would indeed believe that Satan is real and the source of evil and so on and so forth. On the other hand, the idea was also supported by feminists of the day. And I suspect that most of them probably didn't believe that Satan was real, but they saw these kinds of claims as being another example of kind of male oppression, because the victims were typically, not always, but typically female. So what evidence was there to support these claims? Well, there were two main sources. The first was testimony coming directly from children. So there was a spate of allegations, initially in America, but then it spread around the world to other countries as well, including the UK, against workers in daycare centres. And probably, arguably the most notorious of these cases was the McMartin preschool case. This was a daycare centre where initially allegations came from a mother of one of the children there who was actually suffering from schizophrenia, but it spread to other parents. They began asking their children what had been going on. And ultimately this led to the arrest of Raymond Buckey, his mother, who owned the daycare centre, and 5 other workers at the centre. It was claimed that over 350 children had been identified as victims of this bizarre satanic abuse that was said to be taking place there. By 1990, so this is kind of some 6 years later, charges had been dropped against the 5 co-workers due to lack of evidence. And in 1990 also, the case came to trial of Raymond Buckey and his mother. Buckey was acquitted of most charges. His mother was acquitted of all. It was the longest and most expensive trial in US history. Buckey then went to retrial. He was retried on 8 charges. The jury was deadlocked, and ultimately the case was dismissed. So no one was convicted in this case, but Buckey spent many years in prison as a consequence of it. It's incredible when you read back over the details of this case that it was really ever taken seriously. There were all kinds of allegations made that could be immediately shown to be untrue. It was alleged that there was a network of tunnels under the daycare centre, and the grounds were dug up and there were no tunnels found. It was all kinds of other claims that could very easily be disproved, but it still went ahead to trial. And as I said, the longest and most expensive trial in US history. And also over this same kind of period, there were over 100 centres in America, in the UK, Europe and Australia, who were also investigated regarding similar kinds of allegations. So that was the children's testimony was one of the 2 main sources of evidence supposedly supporting the existence of satanic ritualized abuse. The second source was adult testimony. This was, again, really, it started off in a big way in America back in the 1980s. There was a lot of situations where people were going in for therapy, suffering from very common psychological problems, things like depression, anxiety, relationship difficulties, insomnia, whatever, a whole host, with no memories ever of being the victims of childhood sexual abuse. But by the time the therapy was finished, many of these people were convinced that they had been so abused, typically at the hands of their own parents. And what's more, in many cases, they had vivid and detailed memories to actually back that up. And in some of these cases, the abuse was of a satanic nature. In other words, it was this kind of very extreme claims of abuse, often involving satanic cults with lots and lots of people involved, and the most kind of bizarre and extreme forms of abuse that you can imagine. Obviously, this was a very, very serious situation. It led to families being torn apart. It led to legal prosecutions, to convictions, and it led to a great deal of fear and anxiety throughout the societies involved. And the big obvious question, were these memories that had been recovered during the therapy real memories of events that really had taken place in objective reality, or were they false memories? So in terms of the reasons for doubt that began to arise, And eventually it was thought at the time maybe had won the day. Firstly, there was no physical forensic evidence. And when you stop and think about it, the kind of claims that were being made of babies being sacrificed, sexual orgies, drinking of blood, blah, 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 all this stuff, you might have expected the odd physical trace here or there, but there just weren't any. And, the idea that, well, these were very powerful people, therefore they could cover up after themselves, you can only take that so far. You would have expected some evidence, some dead bodies to be found, but there was nothing. There was no physical forensic evidence to support these claims. Now, again, I'm just going to go off a little bit of a tangent here, because some of you might be thinking, well, I've heard of cases where there has been ritual abuse where children have actually died, and this is in fact the case. But I would say, I'd point out that these belong to actually a different category. We've had a number of cases, even in the UK, where particularly in communities with roots in Africa, where there are certain belief systems that say if a child misbehaves very badly, the idea that they might be possessed is taken very seriously, and steps will be taken to actually exorcise the demon from the child, and that often will involve all kinds of horrible physical abuse. That really does occur, there's no question about that, and in some cases has led to children actually being killed. So we do have forensic evidence for that, up to and including dead bodies. This should not be confused with the kind of satanic abuse claims that I've been talking about before this. For one thing, the people doing the abuse are not Satanists. They are, in fact, typically fundamentalist Christians. It really is kind of comparing apples and pears to see these as being kind of examples of the same thing. There was an article in The Guardian back in 2012 by Louise Hunt. The link between belief in spirit possession and child abuse came to public attention following the death in the year 2000 in Haringey, North London, of Victoria Climbié, who was from the Ivory Coast. Research found that her guardians, Marie Teresa Cueo and Carl Manning, had tortured the 8-year-old partly through belief that she was possessed by an evil spirit, a belief supported by their church leaders. In 2005, 3 adults in East London were convicted of child cruelty to another 8-year-old from Angola. She had been starved, beaten, cut with a knife, and had chili peppers rubbed in her eyes in the belief that she was possessed. I mean, this is clearly horrible stuff, but it's coming from the totally opposite direction to the claims regarding Satanism. The last major official study of child abuse linked to accusations of witchcraft was carried out in 2006. It identified 74 cases of abuse in the UK since 2000, where a clear link could be established. Now, some of the advocates of satanic ritual abuse kind of leapt on this and said they were basically trying to argue that, while we're willing to accept that this is a reality, we won't accept that kind of middle-class white children are being used as victims in satanic ritual abuse, and this is basically racist. I mean, this is completely nonsense. As I said before, it's comparing apples and pears. So, okay, no physical evidence when it comes to the satanic ritual abuse claims. The first thread of evidence that was put forward, I mentioned earlier, were children, particularly from the daycare centres. And we can now look back and see that they were inappropriately questioned. The kind of techniques that were used to question them were entirely inappropriate. If you read the transcripts of what went on here, you'd see that the children would repeatedly deny that any of this stuff was happening. And all of their denials would be kind of ignored, and they'd be asked again and again. They'd be lied to. They'd be told that other children have remembered this stuff. There'd be really, very, very unacceptable forms of interrogation. Eventually, the children, probably out of sheer exhaustion, or certainly finding the whole situation very unpleasant and wanting to get away from it, would agree that yes, they could remember it had happened, and then they would be rewarded, they'd be praised, and it really isn't surprising that the techniques that were used produced the outcome that they did. Leading questions, the use of anatomically correct dolls, and so on and so forth. And also bogus experts on the signs of abuse. There were many experts brought in, experts in scare quotes, and they would point to various very, very common aspects of childhood life, things like bedwetting, fear of the dark, temper tantrums. These were all seen as being surefire signs that these children had been abused, which of course they're not. They're very common amongst children of all sorts. One of the very good books on this that I would recommend if you want to read more is Satan's Silence by Debbie Nathan and Michael Snedeker. Debbie Nathan was the first journalist in the world, because initially the journalists were kind of accepted that this stuff was going on, and many of them continued to do so, but some of them started to get skeptical, and Debbie Nathan, to her credit, was one of the first. Her book on this, as I say, very, very highly recommended. So what about the other strand of evidence, the recovered memories? Well, basically, again, I think we can make a very strong case that these were not recovered memories of events that had actually taken place. They were false memories. Again, I can talk about this more at the Q&A if people are interested, but the phenomenon of repression is not supported by good empirical evidence, despite the fact that it's a very, very widely held belief amongst the general public, amongst clinicians, amongst legal professionals. The memory experts, the people who study memory as their main focus of activity, are very, very dubious about the very concept of repression. We now are at a stage, and again, I can talk more about this later, there's no doubt that false memories can arise either spontaneously or as a result of external influences. We're all quite capable of generating false memories without any help from anybody else, but there are two contexts in particular where false memories are very likely to arise. The first is if you take part in an experimental psychology study where people are deliberately trying to implant false memories. And the second would be in therapy. We now know from what we've learned from the experimental studies that the kind of therapeutic context provides an almost kind of perfect context for the formation of memories. This is a quote from a paper by Lindsay and Reed. Extreme forms of memory work in psychotherapy combine virtually all of the factors that have been shown to increase the likelihood of illusory memories or belief. You have a situation where you have a trusted authority, the therapist, who communicates a rationale for the plausibility of hidden memories of long ago childhood trauma. And the idea is that many clients have hidden memories, that the client's psychological symptoms and physical symptoms and dreams are evidence of them, and that if the client expresses any doubt that they were ever abused, well, that is itself further evidence that it really did happen. Secondly, that trusted authority provides a very strong motivation for attempting to recover the memories. You have to recover the memories if you're going to get better, no matter how painful it is. Thirdly, the client is repeatedly exposed to suggestive information from multiple sources. So they're given books to read, other survivors' stories, comments and interpretations offered by the therapist, and so on. And that provides a script for recovering these memories of abuse, as well as suggestions about particular details. And finally, there are various techniques that are used, such as hypnosis and guided imagery, that enhance the imagery, the mental imagery associated with these thoughts, and also lower the response criteria in terms of what will count as a memory, so that people are more willing to interpret thoughts, feelings, and images as genuine memories. Other examples of recovered memories, and again, bear in mind exactly the same techniques are used to recover memories here as they are to recover memories of either ordinary, scare quotes, childhood sexual abuse, or satanic ritual abuse. It's the same techniques that are used to also recover memories of alien abduction, memories of past lives, and so on. Now, as I said before, we've now got to a situation where we've got a whole range of experimental techniques that can be used to implant implant any memories, any false memories, in a sizable minority of a population of volunteers. It won't work on everybody, but it will work on quite a lot of people. One of the very first studies carried out by Elizabeth Loftus, a very famous study called the Lost in the Shopping Mall study, where people were told that the study was about looking at how much detail people could remember of childhood events that they had experienced. And the experimenters had got in touch typically with the parents of the volunteer and found out some things that genuinely had happened, you know, maybe going on to a holiday into a particular place or whatever. And they gave the volunteers in the experiment 4 different scenarios, things that that they said had happened during their childhood. In fact, one of them hadn't happened, and that 3 had, according to the parents, definitely happened. 1 definitely hadn't, and that was getting lost in a shopping mall. And when they presented, basically they presented each of these scenarios and said, tell us what you can remember in as much detail as you can about this. And obviously most people could not remember getting lost in a shopping mall because, well, nobody could remember it because it hadn't happened. And they were told to go away, think about it, see if they could come back with any more details. And so they would go away, they'd come back, they'd be interviewed again. And by the time of the 3rd interview, about a quarter of them had false memories of having been lost in a shopping mall. Now, obviously, that's a kind of mildly stressful event. The idea was that as a child, they'd got lost, they'd got upset, that somebody had found them and taken them back to their parents. But other stressful memories have also been implanted, being attacked by a wild animal, painful hospital procedures, and so on. Now, there's a limit to ethically what kind of memories you can try to implant, obviously. No ethics committee is going to allow you to run a study where you deliberately try to implant false memories of having been the victim of childhood sexual abuse. There is only one situation that I'm aware of where it could be ethically justified to try to actually implant stressful memories of that kind. And this is the case in America of Paul Ingram. Ingram was a well-respected member of his community. He was a Christian fundamentalist. His daughters went off to summer camp, underwent some counseling, and came back and accused him of not only sexually abusing them, but being the head of a satanic cult. And basically we're kind of making all the usual extreme allegations of the kind of abuse that I've been talking about. The prosecution, I believe it was, brought in an expert witness by the name of Richard Offshee. And Offshee had his doubts about how reliable the accounts that Ingram was giving were. And I will let Elizabeth Loftus take up the story here. Let's go back a bit. I've gone a bit too far forward there. At first, Ingram denied everything, and detectives told him he was in denial. After 5 months of interrogation, suggestions from a psychologist, and continuing pressure from detectives and advisors, Ingram began to confess to rapes, assaults, child sexual abuse, and participation in a Satan-worshipping cult alleged to have murdered 25 babies. To elicit specific memories, the psychologist or detectives would suggest some act of abuse. For example, on one occasion, Ingram and several other men raped his daughter. Ingram would at first not remember these fragments, but after a concerted effort on his part, he would later come up with a detailed memory. Now, because of his Christian fundamentalist belief system, he believed that if he prayed to God for guidance, God would reveal the truth to him. God would not mislead him. And so he'd go away, he'd think about these suggestions, and he'd end up with detailed memories, apparent memories of having done whatever he had been accused of. Richard Offshee, a social psychologist hired by the prosecution to interview Ingram and his family members, decided to test Ingram's credibility. Offshee had made up a completely fabricated scenario. He told Ingram that 2 of his children, a daughter and a son, had reported that Ingram had forced them to have sex in front of him. As with the earlier suggestions, Ingram at first could not remember this, but Offshee urged Ingram to try to think about the scene and try to see it happening, just as the interrogators had done to him earlier. Ingram began to get some visual images. Ingram then followed Offshee's instructions to prey on the scene. That was the phrase they used, to go and prey on it, and try to remember more over the next few hours. Several hours later, Ingram had developed detailed memories and wrote a 3-page statement confessing in graphic detail to the scene that Offshee had invented. Offshee noted that this was not the first time that a vulnerable individual had been made to believe that he had committed a crime for which he originally had no memory and which evidence proved he could not have committed. What is crucial about the Ingram case is that some of the same methods that are used in repressed memory cases were used with Ingram. These include the use of protracted imagining of events and authority figures establishing the authenticity of these events. As I say, that's probably the only case I can think of where it was actually justified to try to implant false memories to prove that Ingram was unreliable. He still got convicted. Again, if you want to read more about that particular case, there's an excellent, if very, very disturbing and distressing book by Lawrence Wright, the journalist, Remembering Satan, and also the book by Richard Offshee and Ethin Watters. So are things better today? It depends where you look. What is clear is that there is there's still these kind of beliefs, particularly about repression, and to a certain extent, a lesser extent maybe, but to a certain extent about satanic abuse, are still around today. There's a big difference of opinion between the kind of memory experts who, as I said earlier, kind of are very dubious about these kind of concepts, and the practitioners, the clinicians, and also the general public, legal professionals, and so on. I took part with the late James Ost and several other people in a survey a few years back of clinical psychologists and hypnotherapists to look at their experiences and their beliefs. And what we found was that amongst the clinicians, amongst the practitioners, there's a very broad range of views. There are some who would totally agree with my perspective on this, but there are others who would totally disagree with it. So we found 27.7% reported that they had seen clients who remembered abuse from a state of prior amnesia. In other words, they believed in repression. Furthermore, 22.5% indicated that they believed such reports, the recovered memories, were usually or always essentially accurate. But 27.5% stated that they believed that such reports were never or rarely essentially accurate. So again, very big range of beliefs on that. 32.4% indicated that they'd seen a case reporting satanic stroke ritualistic abuse. 38.2% indicated that they believed such reports were usually or always essentially accurate. 25.8% say they believe that such reports were never or rarely essentially accurate. Again, this big split within that group. 39.6% reported they'd seen a case that met the criteria for multiple personality disorder, stroke dissociative identity disorder, as it's now known. 27.8% indicated that they believe such reports were usually or always essentially accurate. And 26.8% stated they believed such reports were never or rarely essentially accurate. And finally, 35.9% reported they'd dealt with cases of suspected false memories, and 86.5% stated they believed that false memories of childhood sexual abuse were possible. Now, in a sense, you might think that's quite encouraging, that the vast majority believe that false memories of childhood sexual abuse are possible. I kind of can't help thinking about the almost 15% who actually believe that false memories of childhood sexual abuse just are impossible. I mean, that's kind of quite worrying. We can trace, when we look back, we can trace the influence of certain books in the way these ideas have developed and spread. So when it comes to multiple personality disorder, this was first brought to kind of public attention back in the 1950s. Very famous book by Thigpen and Cleckley called The Three Faces of Eve. And this was turned into, well, 2 films I think were made about this case. The more recent one starring Joanne Woodward. This was, as I say, one of the very first cases of so-called multiple personality disorder where apparently Eve had 3 different alters, each with their own different personalities, and so on and so forth. In this case, there was no suggestion of any link with childhood sexual abuse. Thigpen and Cleckley themselves, many years later, were very skeptical about the sudden apparent alleged increase in cases of multiple personality disorder. Now, they wrote in 1984, since reporting a case of multiple personality, Eve, over 25 years ago, we've seen many who were thought by others or themselves to have the disorder, but we've found only one case that fits the diagnosis. Over the past 3 decades, we have together seen tens of thousands of psychiatric patients. Other than Eve, we've seen only one case presented by a psychiatrist in Georgia that appeared to be undeniably a genuine multiple personality. So they clearly were concerned at this kind of what was actually an explosion in the kind of diagnosing. But anyway, let's go back a little bit now. Another very influential book, and I remember reading this as an undergraduate and believing it because it was presented as you can see there, the classic true story of a woman possessed by 16 separate personalities. And this was the book Sybil. It was an international bestseller. It was turned into a film, again, starring Joanne Woodward. She seems to be getting a bit typecast here. It was written by Flora Rita Schreiber. And there were 3 main kind of characters involved in this scenario. There was Flora Rita Schreiber, who wrote the bestseller. There was Sybil, that wasn't her real name. And there was her therapist, Dr. Cornelia Wilbur, very, very ambitious therapist who wanted to make a name for herself. And the way that the story is presented in the book, it appears that Sybil has various kind of psychological issues. She goes to see Dr. Wilbur, and Dr. Wilbur realizes that she is a case of multiple personality. The way this would typically kind of become apparent to a therapist would be someone who turns up reporting things like, finding themselves in strange cities and not knowing how they've got there, or being told by friends and relatives that they've engaged in various bits of behavior that they have no memory of, and so on, because obviously one of the other selves was in charge at the time. Anyway, according to the book, over many, many years, Dr. Cornelia Wilbur manages slowly and gradually to kind of reintegrate Sybil into a healthy single self again. And I read that as an undergraduate, and like many, many millions of people around the world, I believed it. It was, in fact, not really told in an accurate way. It's a book by Debbie Nathan called Sybil Exposed, the extraordinary story behind the famous multiple personality case. Again, I would highly recommend that book. I mean, she's a great writer and she does fantastic background research. It explores the relationship between these 3 women, and it was a bizarre relationship. I mean, for one thing, the 3 of them shared the profits from the book. Now, that is extremely unusual for a psychiatrist and her patient and the author of the book like this to share the profits. The relationship between Sybil and Dr. Cornelia Wilbur was bizarre, to say the least. I mean, they lived together a lot of the time. They'd go away together. Poor Sybil was kind of hypnotically regressed. She was on pentothal. She was confused. Her situation deteriorated dreadfully. And there were people around at the time who did not believe this was a case of multiple personality, but that's what the publishers wanted. And so that's what they got. They also were very keen to have a happy ending. And at the time the idea for the book was first proposed, Sybil was still a complete mess. But amazingly, she was cured. And the book was a bestseller. This is another now I should say, by the way, this is the idea here with Sybil was that her personality fragmented as a result of severe abuse, it was said, at the hands of her schizophrenic mother. So this was the first book that linked childhood abuse with multiple personality disorder, but at this stage it wasn't satanic. Another very, very influential book. This is not the latest edition, went out to DSM-5, published in 2013. But because this is the official Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, this is like the Bible of psychiatrists, particularly in America. And also, if it's not in the DSM, you won't get it covered on your insurance. And so the fact now that dissociative identity disorder, back in that day it was multiple personality disorder, but now it's dissociative identity disorder, is in there, has given it this kind of official stamp of approval, which it certainly does not deserve. Another incredibly influential book was this one, back in 1980, Michelle Remembers. Another amazing story here. Michelle entered into therapy with Dr. Lawrence Pazder, both Christian fundamentalists, as it turned out, and he realized that she was a multiple personality disorder patient, and he recovered memories of the hideous satanic abuse that she had been subjected to. This included actually Satan himself turning up during one of these rituals. So that's just serious shit. Again, a bestseller, sold all over the world, particularly promoted by Christian fundamentalists, as you might imagine. But this was the first book that linked satanic abuse with multiple personality disorder. And again, suddenly more of these cases were being found. The final dreadful book is this one. This is sometimes referred to as the Bible of the incest industry, The Courage to Heal, by Ellen Bass and Laura Davis. These two are not even psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, whatever. But they wrote this book, which became, again, an international bestseller, included in its advice such as, if you have the tiniest suspicion that you may have been a victim of childhood sexual abuse, then you were. That it was a terrible, terrible, terrible book. I was the external supervisor on Rosie Waterhouse's PhD thesis. Rosie is an English investigative journalist, and she was probably the second journalist in the world to become very skeptical about these claims. And one of the things that she did was to trace how these ideas, and particularly these books, but also conferences and other kind of ways of transmitting information, how these ideas had spread around the world. Just to give you a quote from her thesis, before 1944, there were just 76 cases of MPD reported. Before 1970, there were a total of 79 well-documented cases in the world literature. Prior to 1980, there were around 200. And then by 1986, the cases had risen to 6,000. By the mid-1990s, estimates put the number of MPD/DID cases at 40,000 in North America alone. So when you get these kind of situations of, something that was supposed to be so common, and yet it hadn't ever been reported in the past, then that should cause alarm bells to ring. So in terms of conclusions to this part, as I say, I think we'll have a chat about the worrying signs that are around at the moment about the possibility of this kind of situation developing again. Conclusions: there's no physical forensic evidence that SRA really happens, although there is a lot of physical forensic evidence to demonstrate exorcism-related abuse. Testimony from children that appeared to support SRA was obtained using inappropriate and discredited techniques of questioning. Testimony from adults based upon recovered memories was almost certainly based upon false memories. Again, we talk more generally about the kind of false memory research, if that's something that's of interest to you. The big worry here is that the advocacy of SRA claims runs the very real risk that genuine victims of childhood sexual abuse will not believe that what tends to happen in this area is that the pendulum swings from one extreme to the other, and the sexual abuse of children is a real issue, is a real problem. It's far more prevalent than was once recognized, and it can do serious psychological harm. But if people go promoting these kind of wild claims that are not based upon any proper evidence, then it runs the risk that people will begin to doubt even the genuine cases, and that's not in anyone's best interest. So thank you for listening. Right, I shall stop sharing my screen and hopefully Deborah will reappear.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed that, and it was also very sobering. Really, we had a lot of comments throughout your talk. I think we'll probably start everybody on the questions and answers because people have really engaged with this. They're very interested. What I would say is when I ask somebody to come on and present their question, could you remember that it's a question and not turn it into public speaking on your own account, because a lot of people are asking questions this evening. What I'll do is, if you want me to answer your question for you, I'm quite happy to do so. If you'd rather ask it, then I will just unmute you. The first person is Lee Morgan, and I'm just about to unmute you, Lee, so that you can ask your question. If that's inappropriate and you want me to ask it, that's fine. Just don't say anything. There you go. I've just allowed you to talk. Come on if you'd like to.
Hello, Lee.
Hello, Lee.
Would you like, do you want Deborah to ask the question?
Okay. Never mind. So I can ask it. Lee asks a very interesting question, which is, could you please ask Chris if he's considered any parallels between modern day satanic ritual claims and the events that led to the 17th century Pendle witch trials? He's recognised two factors, and there must be others as well, that appear to span the 400 years since the killing and eating of infants and the victim being under an evil spell, which in today's vernacular might equate to being drugged with a sedative. Any views on those kinds of parallels?
Again, I can't answer with respect to specifically the kind of Pendle witch trials, but certainly you can see lots of parallels to other similar cases. I mean, the Salem witch trials in particular is something that I have kind of looked into. And again, a lot of the factors do kind of seem to be quite similar. I mean, without kind of going into the details, there are certain themes that have been around for centuries with respect to kind of various groups. I mean, the kind of the idea of eating babies, the idea of drinking blood, and so on. They kind of crop up time and time again in kind of different conspiracies, and they're kind of, I think they're kind of, they kind of epitomize evil in our minds, and the way that the kind of stories are unintentionally shaped by others is another factor. Again, I don't know whether that applies in the case of the Pendle witch trials, but I suspect it probably does. You will know more about that than I do, Deborah.
I would say the Salem witch trials really are the dead ringer for this, rather than the Pendle witch trials.
Yeah, I mean, in the Salem witch trials, it was apparent that initially the kind of children involved kind of were behaving kind of in a weird way, but it wasn't necessarily the stereotypical possessed way that the authorities of the day kind of would see as being the right way to do it, so to speak. And gradually, as they learned more, their behaviour changed and more corresponded to what was expected, And you can see that kind of shaping of behaviour in a lot of these situations.
Laura Brown has got an interesting question, and I'm just about to allow you to speak there. Are you there, Laura?
Yes, I am. Yes, thank you. So I was just wondering about the OS study from 2013. You said that was carried out among therapists, and I was just wondering how that was defined, because from what I understand, basically anyone in the UK can call themselves a therapist.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a very good point to make, actually. We had two groups. One was clinical psychologists, and it is not the case that just anyone can call themselves a clinical psychologist. You have to, that is a protected term. You cannot just go around calling yourself a clinical psychologist. But the hypnotherapists, who were the other group, they were basically just kind of gleaned from various sources, and they were, if you like, self-labeled. And one of the things that was quite surprising, you may have noticed that I didn't present separate results for the two groups, was that by and large, they tended to be, we might have expected, I think I would have expected that the hypnotherapists maybe would have more extreme views and less informed views on these things than the clinical psychologists. But in fact, that was not really the pattern that emerged. There was not that. There were a few differences here and there, but nothing to speak of. But the point that I think the kind of more basic point that you're making there, that anyone can call themselves a therapist, is kind of deeply worrying. And a lot of the kind of cases that involve these apparent recovered memories of satanic ritual abuse and so on do arise from kind of people who, are not really properly qualified in the first place. But not all of them, by any means. There are people who've got letters after their name, who write books, who organize conferences, and they also, some of them buy into this stuff. So thanks for that question.
Interesting question from John Dowdle. I've just unmuted you, John. So are you there?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes,
can.
John, yeah.
Yeah, I'm just pointing out that the allegations or claims of UFO abductions and some of these QAnon stories over in America are more recent examples of perhaps what you're talking about, are they not? I don't know if, I'll just add to my question. I mean, I don't know if you recall, there was a guy who got so worked up about these QAnon allegations against the Clintons and various others at the head of the Democrat Party, that he went to a pizza parlor, I think it was in California, armed with an assault weapon, and said he was there, to free the children who were being kept for this ritualistic sexual abuse. And of course, the police turned up eventually. I mean, he just had to admit there was nothing there.
Yeah,
but
he was totally. I do know about that, Pizzagate, as we call it in the trade. Yeah, and he was looking for the cellar where the children were being held, and there was no cellar, and he was totally confused, but totally obviously sincere, and saw himself, as do most of the kind of followers of the whole kind of QAnon conspiracy, see themselves as being on the side of right. It's scary, but there's lots of parallels there, and there's also lots of parallels, as you say, with the kind of alien abduction claims, because it's the same kind of techniques that are used to recover the memories in all of those different cases.
We have a very relevant question here from Lara Rose Iredale. You're unmuted, Lara.
Hello. I just want to sort of, it wasn't really mentioned anywhere in here, but is there anything in the literature or anything about why particularly repressed memories seem to come up quite a lot only in relation to alleged satanic ritual abuse, but yet there's no accusation or anything when it comes to the actual abuse that has been perpetrated by the church that everyone knows about and that has been covered up? Why is it that is a thing, and that people are so het up about, the previous question was talking about the person who went to recover the children from the basement of the pizza parlor, but no one's going knocking on the Vatican door?
Well, I mean, I agree they should be. There's no question at all. And as I say, I would keep emphasizing the fact that, there is no doubt at all that abuse does take place and that it's covered up by powerful institutions in the church. The Roman Catholic Church seems to be particularly notorious. But, the number of people who appeared to have at least had suspicions about Jimmy Savile, there did seem to be quite a lot of them.
It's quite
just to correct you on something that you said very early on there, most of the recovered memories that come up are not for satanic abuse. They are mostly, and again, I kind of hate to say this, but ordinary childhood sexual abuse. So the kind of satanic abuse ones are at the more extreme end of that spectrum. But given that it's the same techniques that are being used, whether we're talking about ordinary childhood sexual abuse, satanic ritual abuse, UFO abductions, past life memories, in the absence of any other corroborating evidence, we need to be cautious, one of the big problems with these kind of cases generally is that, of course, any kind of corroborating evidence is going to be very difficult to come by, because we know that, as I said before, childhood sexual abuse is a reality. It typically, I mean, a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about it, as you're probably aware. It's not usually a stranger. It's usually within the family. You know, the most common form is father-daughter, and it will take place behind closed doors, and there'll be no witnesses. So, you know, I mean, and that is an inherent problem, and I don't know what you do about that. But, you know, I would say that if you have a situation where somebody was I mean, all the evidence would suggest that you are much more likely to remember a traumatic event. There are certain circumstances where you might not, if you were too young, you know, if you were below the age of, say, 3 years old or whatever. But generally, traumatic events are remembered better than non-traumatic events. They're not typically repressed. Nobody ever forgot being in a concentration camp.
The next question here is from Nick. He's asked me to ask it on his behalf. And there are a couple of people along this kind of theme. Really, they say, what similarities do you see with this and the present rash of QAnon beliefs?
Well, again, there are, I mean, in terms of the kind of wider sociological type analysis, I mean, they both fall very clearly under the kind of general umbrella term of moral panics. With all that implies, you know, that basically you've got a situation where there is seen as being some kind of contest between good and evil. There are others, the other, who are the evil ones. We are the righteous ones. Basically, this is obvious, I suppose, but, you know, no real evidence to support any of the claims that are being made. And again, the worrying thing seems to be that doesn't seem to matter to so many of the followers of QAnon and so on, or even the kind of, I mean, QAnon itself, that the level of support that it has is sometimes, I think, exaggerated in the press. I mean, I kind of watched a lecture by Joe Usinski recently, who's kept a very close eye on all this stuff. But the ideas that are kind of part and parcel of the QAnon conspiracy are often endorsed. So, I mean, the fact that the vast majority of Republicans still believe that the election was rigged and that Joe Biden didn't really win it fairly is kind of stunning, given the kind of complete lack of any evidence to support that claim. But people don't actually seem to care that much. And that I kind of find deeply worrying. And I mean, and obviously, I'd imagine all the people who go along to Conway Hall and listen to lectures like this are probably people who quite like evidence. I know I do. And I kind of think it's kind of quite important what's true and what's not. But there seems to be this very worrying, obviously, in this country with our own little mini Trump, don't we? I mean, Boris is a known liar, but people don't seem to care. It's bizarre.
Well, this takes perfectly into the next question by Heather Kay. Heather, are you there? I've just unmuted you.
Hi there. My question's really, is there a personality type that's more susceptible to believing in or make them more susceptible to false memories? For example, there's been a lot of work around magical thinking and schizotypy, and I was just wondering if it was the same with false memories.
Yeah, indeed. There is. I mean, there are quite a number of personality factors that seem to be correlated with susceptibility to false memories. And what's particularly interesting from my point of view is they're the same personality factors that correlate with paranormal belief and reports of paranormal experiences. So I think there's a kind of an interesting link there. I mean, a lot of the kind, I can kind of rattle them off. They all tend to intercorrelate with each other as well. So dissociativity, which is the kind of, it's quite a vague term used in lots of different ways. I've already talked about dissociative identity disorder, and that would be seen as being a very extreme form of dissociativity that I would have my doubts about. I think it's not a valid diagnosis, but that's maybe a discussion for another time. But dissociation in the sense of people who have out-of-body experiences, who report missing time experience, who my grandma would have described as being away with the fairies. I think, you know, that'd be a high dissociative person. Absorption, either the kind of person who gets completely absorbed in what you're doing. If you're reading a book or reading a novel, you're completely shut off the outside world. Fantasy proneness. Often, people with very, very creative people with really good imagination spend a lot of time fantasizing. Hypnotic susceptibility, all of those things have been shown to correlate with susceptibility. Schizotypy, as you mentioned yourself, that is also correlated with susceptibility to false memories. And there are other kind of factors like, loss of sleep, use of cannabis, all kinds of other things that can also have an effect as well. But there is definitely a kind of a personality profile. And as always in these cases, we're not saying that everybody who is susceptible to false memories would score highly on all of these things, but as a group, people who are susceptible to false memories would tend to score higher than people who aren't.
There's a question here which it's turned up in the chat line, and somebody's asked me to ask it, and which I'm doing with pleasure because I did actually watch this series over the weekend. It's did you watch the recent Netflix documentary Sons of Sam? And there was a book by a guy called Murray Terry called The Ultimate Evil, which suggested that David Berkowitz was part of an elaborate satanic group, and that this spread across the United States and that he didn't act alone. And that kind of, I read the book at the time, and like all conspiracy theory books, it's very pleasing to read just because all of the strands pull together. Doesn't mean it's true, but it is perfect in a way. And of course, it appears that he may have been working with other people, but that doesn't mean that there's a hyper-competent satanic cult working across the United States as well. So it's an interesting program. What did you...
I didn't see it, so I can't really comment on the program, but I will watch it. It sounds like my sort of thing. Can I make any kind of comments at all there? Again, as you will know, Deborah, one of the factors behind conspiratorial thinking is our amazing ability to make connections between things and so on, and sometimes make connections when they're not really there. One of the reasons we're very successful as a species is because our pattern recognition abilities are pretty damn good, but sometimes we overplay it. So without kind of looking at the evidence, I really don't know. We can say from Professor Jean Lafontaine's analysis back in the mid-80s, when she investigated kind of a few hundred claims of satanic abuse, that she didn't find any kind of compelling cases. There were a handful of cases where kind of satanic abuse had been used where really the motivation was just sexual. It wasn't kind of religious or magical or satanic in that sense. But used basically to kind of frighten the victims, to say that, so basically it was a charade, if you like. It was an act that was being put on by the perpetrator to keep the victims quiet through threats of all kinds of occult nastiness. Now, again, with the case you just talked about, I don't know. I'd have to have a look.
The interesting thing I think about Berkowitz is it seems like the satanic stuff started, I suppose, with Manson. It was the counterculture to the counterculture, and then it got big in the 70s with the Son of Sam killings, and then it got bigger with all of the abuse cases brought up in childcare and that sort of thing. And looking at the USA in a larger sense, I wonder if there has been a Christian reaction to counterculture, if this is kind of a way of rolling back a rather paranoid Christian interpretation of what's been going on.
It could be. Obviously, fundamentalist Christians would be opposed for so many reasons to the kind of counterculture. And we all know that they kind of found lots of evidence of satanic influences in backwards rock music, don't we? And in other places as well. They could see it wherever they looked. But again, with respect to these particular claims of an organized international kind of conspiracy, there just isn't any evidence that really strongly supports it.
Yeah, so weird stuff happens, but it doesn't mean there's a hyper-competent conspiracy. Yeah. And I'll just wrap it up with one last question. I think even if I haven't brought specific people in, that we've kind of covered your subject areas, there are a lot of people interested in the QAnon capacity theme here. And says, I think quite rightly, that was alarming and fascinating. He said he's curious about your views on how flawed investigative techniques can also have played a part in various cases over here. He mentions Operation Midland Carl Beach case. I believe that was where the police were incredibly gullible about. Yeah.
Well, this is something that if I'd had time, I was basically asked to kind of talk about 45 minutes, and I thought, well, I can just about cover the original Satanic Panic, but not talk as much as I would have otherwise done about the kind of more recent developments, and that would have definitely been one of them. It was a shocking case. I mean, it was, anybody who's read the report by Enrique's report, which is a very, very, very good report. But it's a kind of very, very, very critical about the kind of police operation investigating Operation Midland. This is kind of what happens, unfortunately. I mean, my view is that Savile was a sex offender of the worst kind, and the kind of, once that came out, the kind of reaction is to kind of go too far the other way. And so we had the situation where the kind of official police mantra was believe the victim. Now, there's so much wrong with that, we don't know whether or not someone making an allegation is a victim until it has been investigated. And it's not to say disbelieve the victim, it's to say take the allegation seriously and investigate it impartially. But don't start, the very use, and Enrique's comments on this, to call people victims from the word go is prejudging the outcome. It's, our legal system says you are innocent until proven guilty, but that simply is not the way that things operate in practice, or, in these kind of cases. It's very often assumed that, and I can see why it's happened, because all too often the victims of sexual abuse cases, victims of rape, victims of childhood sexual abuse, have not been believed and not been listened to in the past when they were telling the truth. And it is an inherently very, very difficult and sensitive area. But we really have to, if we're going to kind of be fair to the kind of basic fundamental assumption of innocent until proven guilty, because we've seen far too many cases of lives destroyed by false allegations. The vast majority of allegations, in my opinion, probably are genuine. I don't know that, but I think they probably are. But that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't also be alert to the possibility of false allegations, which can destroy not just one person's life, but whole families.
I think that's a really very that's a very pithy sentence to end it on, actually, because that's the whole point of this, isn't it? Is that it can go horribly, horribly wrong.
It can.
Thank you ever so much for that, Chris. Chris is a very good friend of mine. I've been following his lectures for years and years. It's very interesting. And if you ever do get a chance to listen to his lecture that includes the backwards rock music, then do.
Most of them do, but I resisted the temptation tonight.
Yes, it's an absolute classic, very enjoyable. Thank you everybody very much for turning up this evening. It's been a fascinating talk. If I can remind you as well that Conway Hall Ethical Society does really, really good work. It's been a charity and we've all had a hard time for the last year. But if you've got any spare money and you'd like to make a donation, it would be very much appreciated, and it would be very well spent to encourage free thought to continue. Thank you very much. Good to see you, and keep an eye on the website for the next Ethical Matters talk. Bye-bye.
Thank you.